thank you very much for joining us for the lunch. It's a great pleasure to introduce Michael Caramanis. Michael Caramanis got his BS from Stanford University and his MS and PhD from Harvard University, and teaches is a Boston University professor of mechanical and systems engineering. He served at the Greek National Energy Council from 76 to 79, at the MIT Energy Laboratory from 79 to 82, and was chair of the Greek Regulatory Authority for Energy from Feb 2005 to very recently. He's directed several research projects funded by NSF, EPR, and others. And for those of you who don't know, he's one of the co-authors on the seminal book on spot pricing of electricity with Fred Schweppe, Roger Bond, and Richard Taylor. On a personal note, Michael was one of my advisors during my master's, and I was in Cambridge in the mid-90s, and he still continues to talk to me, and I learned an immense amount of it. So thank you, Michael, for being here.
Thank you for the very generous, too generous perhaps, introduction. I hope I'm not going to cause indigestion, rather. So let me try to sort of simplify my presentation. The emphasis of what I want to say has to do with ways in which power markets can change so as to motivate more efficiency, extraction, and more synergy between demand, new energy technologies, and so on in the brave new world of that is unfolding ahead of us with renewable technologies, renewable generation, and all sorts of additional resources in addition to the ones that we are accustomed to that are coming into the forefront. So, say a few things about the age of renewables, uncertainty, how is uncertainty impacted, how is congestion impacted, and why is congestion important? Transmission and distribution, the transmission and distribution interface. So we have a big transmission system that has been bringing generators together, and now we are thinking of expanding to the distribution network and allowing the distribution network to be more active in collaborating in the enterprise of the power system for the purposes that we mentioned before. So how is the interface important, and how are distribution networks and transmission networks likely to cooperate? One sort of pitch that I want to make is an effort to define the quality of service that we've been talking about, that economists have been talking about loosely for a while, which has to do with the reliability of supply. So how can we define this quality of service in a way that is more precise, in a way that we can price and associate with marginal costs as they develop over time, and in a way that that it matches up with certain specific commodities that actually we are dealing with today in the form of reserves. There are many reserves that are provided by generators primarily, or to a great extent. We did hear some very interesting discussion about how the demand side can participate through demand response in these reserve-like kind of services. Can we commoditize? Can we standardize? Can we completely find an equivalent between these types of reserves, and that might include demand response? And these reserves are proliferating. We did hear again from Andrea that a new type of reserve was introduced to accommodate batteries. So as new types of reserves are being introduced to accommodate potential suppliers of reserves, as the demand side is stepping up to the plate to provide this, perhaps we'll have a broader range of reserves that can be used to essentially commoditize demand response and make it treatable in a very symmetric way with the way that we treat generation provision of demand response. And then I'm going to talk about two basic market change rules: multi-period markets that can capture demand response more effectively. Today we don't have any sort of, I mean, we do have multi-period markets. We have the day-ahead market, which is multi-period. However, there are no ways for demand participants or consumption to participate in a way that they express their true requirements, the true utility, which is what? They have a utility for energy over a period of time as opposed to a utility for capacity. So the only way that we can bid in markets today is to bid myopically, price quantity bid for each hour, right? So that is a limitation for flexible loads that cannot express the requirements and the utility in this way. So for example, if I'm a storage or pumped hydro storage unit, the utility that I extract has nothing to do with each particular hour, but with some requirement which says that over the 24 hours I have to have my reservoir back up to the same state. If you are charging electric vehicles, if you are operating a big parking lot that deals with charging electric vehicles, the requirements are a certain amount of energy over time, and you don't care how this energy by a certain deadline, which is when the vehicles are going to leave, is going to be provided over time. So you can't quite bid using the current limited myopic price quantity bidding rule, which are useful. They should remain, but we have to bring additional bidding rules. So that's one issue that I want to talk about. And the other issue is how distribution networks can be introduced to participate into the markets. And distribution networks have certain similarities, but they have certain notable differences with high voltage transmission networks. And we'll talk about those. They have many more costs. They can deal with real and reactive power effectively, whereas perhaps at the high voltage transmission system you can't do that because reactive power, for those of you that are not familiar, is some sort of a pollutant that certain consumers inject into the power system, which we have to somehow clean out, because otherwise we have high losses. Otherwise we can't have a good quality of power. For example, we can't maintain the voltage level. If we want 110 plus or minus 6 or 7%, we can't do that if we have an excessive amount of these pollutants that we don't get rid of the system. So real and reactive power are additional coupled commodities that we have to deal with in the power market, as well as reserves. So we are accustomed to think of energy as something that's homogeneous. In terms of its nature, it's not homogeneous. It's a bundle, it's a basket of goods and services which are interrelated because they are provided or consumed by the same asset, and therefore they are coupled. And these are real power, reactive power, and different types of reserves. And reserves that are not, again, uniform, but you have different types of them. Very fast reserves, primary reserves, secondary reserves, tertiary reserves. So all of these 4 or 5 things have to be priced, and they have to be priced over time because their value changes over time and over space. And that's very important for the objective that the manufacturing people have here, which is how which has to do with how manufacturing and service industries should respond to the smart grid. And an important thing that I noticed in the talks today, earlier today, very interesting talks. However, I saw that energy was treated as a homogeneous thing, and its cost, perhaps, I mean, you very nicely modeled energy as something that varies over time, right? And the total energy is the integral of the energy consumed over time. However, the cost of energy appeared to be treated as something that's homogeneous, right? Constant over time. And that's the big difference that the smart grid is bringing in here, because it may be less efficient to consume more energy during certain periods of time, but the cost of the energy might be very low during these periods of time, because our wind farms are providing more energy than we can consume. So the cost of energy over time and over space is important. And that spatial variability, location and marginal prices, Ben Hobbs talked very nicely about how location and marginal prices are captured in today's wholesale markets. But there's a further differentiation of the marginal price of energy, where energy read now not one thing, but 4 or 5 related sub-products. And that cost may be the same at some bus of the transmission network that let's say feeds this region of this neighborhood of Philadelphia. But in various sub-locations, now you have further differentiation over time and over space. And that's extremely important if we are to bring in the distribution network. So finally, how do all of these things impact decentralized decisions or decisions by manufacturing and service industries, which may benefit and may actually increase their profit, decrease their costs and increase their profit by responding to these sort of dynamically varying costs. And moreover, how can they participate in the forward-looking markets, the day-ahead markets, in a way that we can plan better and therefore save energy? How does the day-ahead market, how can the day-ahead market be more efficient if we have the demand side bidding and giving us more information? Okay, so I've more or less given you an overview of my talk, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on some details. The age of renewables, how are renewables different? What are the newcomers into the power system that we didn't have at the time of Edison, or we didn't have even 15, 20 years ago? Well, first of all, we have to see this in the context of electricity, which is not storable unless you do other things that require additional costs. You have to do the electricity which involves a huge number of providers and of consumers that are everywhere, and which generate, supply electricity and consume electricity in a manner that is coupled. So everybody is synchronized. The generators are synchronized. You can think of gears that are synchronized. How are they synchronized? They're synchronized through the frequency. right? We have 60 hertz frequency that we can deviate very little from everywhere. So the electric power sector is the largest machine if you view it as a single machine, right? Because since we are synchronized, not only connected through the transmission and distribution networks, but we are also synchronized. It's the largest machine that humans have made. You are trying to exchange something that's not storable, and because it's not storable, if you have disruptions, the system can be desynchronized and fail. So this is what happens with blackouts, right? So in order to avoid failures, we have to deal, and in order to be able to deal with these desynchronizations or disruptions that cause us to lose stability, we have to have, unfortunately, reserves. If you have uncertainty, if you cannot predict the future with absolute certainty, power plants fail, transmission lines fail, demand varies, new kid on the block, renewable generation now varies, and we can't control it. We can't control exactly conventional generation. We feed coal, and this coal has a little bit more earth, but more or less we can control the output there. We can't control wind and solar and so on. We can forecast it, we cannot control it. So uncertainty increases, and as uncertainty increases, we need to have and to procure and operate reserves for system stability and also manage congestion, transmission and distribution congestion. So procure and manage is different. You secure reserves, right, that are standing by, and then you have to use them as you end up needing them, right? So this is the question that, again, the issue that Andrian pointed this morning about people thinking that they can provide into this procurement and hope that they will not be they would not be called upon to do anything. But indeed, when you provide, when you satisfy, we're one of those who satisfy the procurement of the required amounts of reserves, then you accept the responsibility to participate in their use, in their management. So I'm going to say a few things about that. What else is a newcomer? The generation mix is changing, right? We have renewables, centralized and distributed, rooftop photovoltaics, etc. We have more flexible generation, combined cycle natural gas units. We have inflexible generation, nuclear and coal. This is going down as we go forward. You know what's happening with coal units. We have a lot of flexible loads that are new, certainly did not exist at the time of Thomas Edison, electric vehicles, heating and cooling and so on. We have distributed resources. What are those distributed resources? These distributed resources are not only grid-friendly appliances that we all know. General Electric is producing these smart clothes dryers, but there are other things such as power electronics that I'm going to talk about. You continue to have inflexible loads whose mix is going down. That demands capacity. You have reserve requirements that are going up because uncertainty is going up, as I discussed. And you have congestion and or equipment loss of life, which may go up or down depending on how we manage the system. So the big question is, are we going to continue in a form of business as usual, or are we going to have a paradigm shift? The traditional paradigm is what? That we as consumers, we do whatever we feel like. Our demand varies over time, and we want instant gratification regardless of what is happening on the other side of the meter. So therefore, generation or supply has to follow our requirements as consumers. Is this going to change? Because now generation is not actually controllable or dispatchable, or all of it. As we have more and more wind and so on, we can't control it. So should the demand now start following some of this uncertain generation? And is it possible to do that because of the new types of loads, the new types of demands? So what are the key questions here about so-called utility of the future? Should we focus on demand side of the meter decisions, control distributed energy services, and so on? How significant or disruptive is or transformational are distributed resources? We have all sorts of distributed resources, rooftop photovoltaics, this, that, small, even cogeneration with natural gas generated internal combustion engines and so on. So are the sustainability fundamentals, and by fundamentals I mean the true economics, the true efficiency, pushing up into pushing distributed resources in a good way, or is this happening because of subsidies? Is it happening because of societal values? So we don't care about environmental sustainability, or we care overly about environmental sustainability. These are societal values. And after all, and whatever is pushing these distributed resources, does it matter? And if it matters, what platform will best integrate distributed generation and distributed resources? How we can integrate these new things that are coming into the picture. So here is a very gross but informative unbundling, if you wish, of the costs, right? So at home we pay, I don't know, up in Massachusetts we pay 12 cents per kilowatt hour. People in Texas pay less, depends on where you are. But out of 100% that you pay on average for the kilowatt hour that you consume, how can you separate or unbundle these costs? More than half is due to centralized generation and transmission. The high voltage copper wires, the cost of fuel, the brick and mortars of centralized generators. And so let's say 60%, about 5% has to do with transmission, and the remaining 30 to 40% has to do with distribution costs. So it is quite correct that we have addressed the biggest chunk of the cost by establishing wholesale markets that are bringing efficiency gains to the 60% of the overall costs. But now, perhaps it's about time to address the remaining 30 to 40%. And in order to address that, we need a lot more smarts. We need not only smart meters, but many other things: control, markets, accounting of costs, dynamic and space and geographically varying at the distribution level. Many things are changing. Sometimes the flow of power goes from distribution utility to upstream to the transmission system. This doesn't happen quite yet in the United States. In Spain and in Germany, it happens in some cases that distribution utilities are a net injector of energy into the system during some hours. So how do we go ahead, and how can we take advantage of all of this? The utility of the future, which is a big project at MIT, that the MIT Energy Initiative is taking up, has compiled, and I'm not going to bother you with all these testimonials, has compiled testimonials by stakeholders in the United States, in Europe, and so on, who all, almost inadvertently and uniformly, claim that distributed generation is going to be a disruptive technology, that it is to the best interest of utilities and businesses and so on to address, and that's where most of the expenditure is going to take place, and there are actually forecasts of this that this is true in Europe as well, where the Europeans are maybe a little bit more conservative, less laissez-faire as far as power markets are concerned. What are they preparing to do? They call upon their members to address this. Are they right? Well, perhaps they're right, but the best way to investigate whether they're right or not is to actually pay attention to the fundamentals. And fundamentals are essentially the marginal costs. How do costs vary over space and over time, and can a marginal cost-based type of response, either market or standards-based or what have you, take advantage of the communication, and not only the communication and computation revolution, but also the new technology. Very important new technology. Distributed generation, renewable generation, the presence of power electronics that make their entrance for the purpose of doing for example, the power electronics that rooftop PV brings upon with it has a primary objective, which is what? To convert the direct current that comes out of the panels to synchronized AC so that they can inject it into the grid. Okay, so it comes in for free. But how often, what percent of the time are these power electronics utilized? When the sun shines, 100% when the sun is perpendicular. So most of the time, even when the sun is out, they're underutilized, and at night they're not. Can they provide something useful to the power system when they are not utilized, when there's excess capacity, right? The same thing with power electronics in an elevator bank. How often are all elevators operating at the same time? So you have excess capacity in these power electronics. And these power electronics are ideal for taking care of the pollution into the power system, which I mentioned before, and which is known as reactive power or power factor and so on that you may have heard. So if we understand these costs, perhaps then we can sort out the politics, we can sort out the regulatory issues, we can sort out what utilities' conservative attitude is. They don't want to obviously change. And we've seen this in the overall history, in communications. We've seen that Mabel fought the deregulation. Like utilities in the US thought that creating markets and so on would be a disaster, and so on and so forth. but confronted with the opportunity to realize a profit sooner or later. The British did it in 1990. We did it in 1997. We started, and we've made quite a lot of progress. We haven't done anything at the distribution level, or not much, except for energy service companies that somehow go and close deals on the basis of the expected average of these marginal costs. It would be much, much different if we could see these marginal costs, if developers of new technologies and of new appliances and so on and so forth knew that these were going to be the rules, and therefore they would decide to introduce this innovation into products, into new products. That's exactly what we saw happening in the communications industry. You could foresee certain applications that could benefit from free access to telephone lines and so on and so forth. But there were all sorts of other applications that you could not foresee, did not exist, that were developed later. So having free access, having these rules set clearly, allowed for innovation. Same thing can happen in the power sector. So let me try to say a few things about the transmission network and the distribution network. So the transmission network has certain differences from the distribution network. First of all, it's meshed. Second of all, it's operating at high voltage, and therefore it has relatively low losses. On the average, we have 8% on the average, over seasons, over hours, and so on and so forth. 8% of the energy that we consume is lost over the wires. Of this 8%, barely 1.5% to 2% takes place at the high voltage, right? Because high voltage, by definition, is associated with low cost. The rest takes place at the distribution network. And that's average. So during certain hours at the distribution network, you don't have, the average is 6%, but during some hours you may have 8%. Now the marginal losses, or 9%, the marginal losses are twice that, right? So you may have marginal losses of 20%, which does not take place in different locations at the same time. So high loads in the commercial business sector take place at noon, say, or during business hours. High loads and high losses take place in the radial feeder lines that supply residential areas. So it may be cheaper to charge, let's say, your electric vehicle at your residence during business hours than it is during the evening, and vice versa. You know, so these are sort of this is an indication of opportunities. So you have locational marginal prices for energy, and locational marginal prices which may be aggregated by zone if you wish. You know, we don't like zonal pricing in the United States for reserves. But the reserves are not so crucial to provide at a particular bus, you know, as long as you have a certain amount of reserves in a particular zone or region. So these are prices that are discovered at the high voltage transmission. We are doing this. So power markets today, wholesale power markets, are discovering these prices. And not just one price of energy, but prices of reserves, of secondary regulation reserves and tertiary reserves. So in PJM, the primary reserves are kind of still dealt with with, with annual contracts and so on, but it doesn't have to be the case, but they are. But secondary and tertiary reserves are cleared by markets. So we have locational marginal prices of secondary reserves, regulation reserves, and tertiary reserves. And in PJM, the secondary reserves, depending on the year, depending on the hour, and so on and so forth, vary from 0 to 10 cents per kilowatt per hour. And tertiary reserves are lower, 0 to 2, 3 cents, or 0 to $20, $30 per megawatt hour. So these are time dependent and location dependent. But this location, which is a bus, that also reflects congestion. So congestion is very important. If you go to PJM's website and you look at the 5-minute prices, you see very high prices in the east. New Jersey, that's why New Jersey doesn't like PJM. Or does it? Who said so? I didn't. Somebody said so. And you see very low prices elsewhere. That's because you have congestion, meaning that some of these lines are overloaded. So if you want to send power from here to here, some of it will come this way, and some of it will come this way. So the damn Kirchhoff's laws, which many lawyers, I've heard lawyers saying, can't we repeal these laws? So Kirchhoff's laws will force power to flow some over one path and some over another. So you may have 100 paths, but if there is a congested line over one or two of these paths, you can't send more power from A to B. So therefore, you have to back down inexpensive generation and substitute it with more expensive generation. So this is the congestion cost. So this reveals itself as a higher price here on one side of the congestion than on the other. So these prices reflect congestion. How do we translate these prices to prices at the various locations of the distribution network? Okay, so that's an important question. And therefore, what is the interface between the transmission and the distribution network? At the distribution network, you have congestion that reveals itself in different ways. We don't have capacity constraints that we enforce like we do in the transmission system. In the transmission system, if we try to overload a line, and this line is thermal capacity constraint, if we don't make sure not to overload this line is going to sag, and then it's going to disconnect and create disruptions that may be very costly. So here we try to enforce capacity constraints. Down here, we don't. Although this transformer may have a rated capacity, during certain hours, we may load the transformer beyond its rated capacity. The transformer doesn't fail. Occasionally it does. I've seen transformers burst into flames. In Manhattan, I've seen it. It doesn't happen too often. But usually what happens when you overload them is that their life starts declining very, very fast. So if you operate a transformer at its rated capacity, it has a 15, 20-year life. If you operate it at less than its rated capacity, then its life doesn't degrade. If you operate it at a higher rate, then it's like having put the double tariff or the triple tariff on your taximeter. So this is a marginal cost. The decline of life is a marginal cost that reflects congestion or overloading of assets. You have higher losses that are very important here. And also, you can deal with real and reactive power at this level. How come we decided not to deal with real and reactive power? I was talking to Andy Ott, who was in the mid-90s. He came, who was in charge of developing markets, and they read the book that was the Bible for marginal cost pricing at this time, and they said, oh, these guys say that we have to price real and reactive power. But reason prevailed because they saw that reactive power, even if it were priced, it wouldn't make a big difference. It was a very small part of the overall cost, number one. And number two, you could not have competitive provision of reactive power. Why? I'll show you the equations in a minute. So when real power flows over distance, there are losses. So therefore, a generator that's closer to load has a somewhat competitive advantage because it incurs fewer losses in supplying load. But the losses of reactive power that flows are much, much higher, right? Because they do not depend on the resistance, they depend on sort of a much higher coefficient. So therefore, reactive power cannot be provided from far away. You can't buy reactive power in Boston that comes from Canada because half of it is going to be lost, right? So only local generators are able to provide reactive power. What's the new thing? The new thing is that reactive power, so the filtering out of this pollutant that we call reactive power, can be done by distributed resources which are not generators, are not rotating machines, but they are power electronics. They are converters and inverters, sort of capacitors and inductors that can either consume or produce reactive power, and therefore they can provide reactive power. So reactive power that's generated by distribution lines, that's generated by inductive motors, air conditioners, and so on and so forth, can be compensated right at the source or very close to the source by these power electronics that we now have. We didn't have many of them. Now we have them. And utilities actually started installing some big such inverters, 4 or 5 in a distribution network, 1 or 2 megawatts each, which were doing a much better job than a generator because they were kind of closer. However, they were still lumpy, and they are still lumpy. So it's so much better to use resources that are distributed. For example, an electric vehicle has a 50 kW or kVAR capability. Its charger, modified slightly, can provide up to 50 kVAR of reactive power, which is a fair amount if you have many of them. Rooftop photovoltaics. Variable speed drives, which today are powering most heating and cooling systems. So most heating and cooling systems are powered by variable speed drives. Distributed gas generation has this capability because now the distributed small generators that we have the capability to, they have inductive capability, so they have the capability to produce power at a certain frequency, whereas the old ones were just observing the network's frequency and they were matching it. Once the network went down, they had to go down too. Now the new ones can actually actively influence and maintain a frequency. So you have all of these small distributed resources that can get rid of losses and provide voltage control in the small. So let me, since time is passing, let me let me show how this is taking place, and then I'll make a few more remarks. Okay. So here's reactive power. That has to be supplied at one node n, and this is the reactive power that's consumed or produced at some point further down a feeder line in the distribution network. I'm looking at the difference between here and here, right? So this is the end of this is the interface between the high voltage wholesale market transmission system and the distribution system, right? So the power that you supply here must equal to the power that's consumed there plus losses, right? Both for real and for reactive power. And so for reactive power, you can see that the reactive power that has to be supplied is the reactive power consumed plus the reactive power lost. And the reactive power lost is a function of real and reactive power. And it has a coefficient which is much higher than the coefficient that real power has. So this is why reactive power doesn't travel very far. Right? So if you modulate this, so ideally you would like to modulate this so that the losses are zero, and also so that you do not need to provide reactive power. So essentially, you have to produce a little bit more than the reactive power consumed, so as to cover the reactive power of that will be generated over the distribution lines. And so real power also, that the real power that you provide has to be equal to the real power that's consumed plus the losses. But the losses now are in real power are much lower if you get this guy to be zero, right? So reactive power affects not only the cost of providing reactive power, but also the cost of providing real power. And in order to have good quality, we need to maintain voltage, right? You don't want your lights to start becoming yellow or fall or increase more than 6 or 7% above the rated capacity, because your appliances start getting to be damaged from that point on, and so on and so forth. Your refrigerator doesn't work properly. So you need to do voltage control. And voltage control, the fall in voltage, is also a function of reactive power. So you can increase the voltage by producing reactive power. You decrease the voltage by consuming reactive power, right? So all of these power electronics, all of these additional resources can decrease losses of real and reactive power, primarily real power we're interested in, decrease the degradation and the loss of life of transformers, because the loss of life of transformers depends on the apparent power, which is the sum of these squares square root, right? Some sort of a Pythagorean theorem. So you decrease the wear and tear of, you can mitigate the loss of life of transformers, you can mitigate losses, you can mitigate the cost of voltage control. With all of these distributed resources that are there and are completely not put into any use today. So putting them into use could be thought of as putting this into dual use, right? Because that's a use over and above what they were meant to, right? So the photovoltaics paid for the power electronics, but now these power electronics can be put into dual use. How do you put them into dual use? How do you motivate them? By pricing reactive power appropriately and particular location. So now rooftop photovoltaics have the right signal for where to locate. So they should locate in a place where the sum of what the income that they can get by selling the real power and by selling their capability to filter to compensate reactive power. So they would locate in the right place. If there are places that are not good or saturated, they would have a disadvantage and they would get a pricing. So new resources, new appliances, new innovations in terms of real and reactive power, voltage control, and satisfying all of these needs would also be motivated appropriately if we could price. So the idea is to be able to price correctly real and reactive power at the distribution network, capture the interface, and if you do that, you can also provide reserves appropriately. Because if the provision of reserves depends very much on the marginal losses. If the marginal losses are, let's say, 15%, and I decrease my consumption by 1 kilowatt, the relief that the system is going to see will be 1.15 kilowatts, right? So then the provision of reserves at the distribution level is very much guided and is very much influenced and motivated and is more efficient if you see the actual value of it, right? Because the value of decreasing your consumption or the cost of increasing your consumption by 1 kW is different at the same time in different locations and at different times, of course, likewise. So being able to do this pricing, these calculations is extremely important, and I'm not going to go into the details of how this could be reflected in prices, but the way to reflect this marginal cost into distribution location, distribution prices by location and by time is sort of well understood. We've done certain applications, for example, this is a real Southern Cal Edison feeder where we have calculated, this is a primarily residential and commercial, this is primarily small industrial feeder. So at each one of these points, we calculate the value of real and reactive power, the value of providing reserves, and then you could, so we have electric vehicles here that optimize over 24 hours and so on and so forth. Now, the issue is one of practicality. Is it tractable to have such markets? Can we calculate these marginal costs, and particularly in multi-period markets, over 24 hours, in a reasonable amount of time and with reasonable accuracy and so on, because the requirements now are more onerous than the requirements that you have in the wholesale market. In the wholesale market, you can linearize the load flows, you can disregard or approximate losses, you don't have to worry about voltage, you don't have to worry levels, you don't have to worry about reactive power. Here, you can't take these shortcuts. You can still simplify, but now the nice thing is that if you solve detailed load flow, which is known to be non-convex and therefore difficult to solve, here you can bypass the convexity issues that are still there but are less important because of the radial nature. You see, distribution networks are kind of simpler trees. There's no coupling, there's no meshing to the extent that you have in the high voltage. So here you have less meshing. And so therefore, you can deal with these non-convexities. However, the computation is still cumbersome. And the good news is that that there are distributed ways of doing these calculations. And rather than having one big computer do all the clearing, you can have distributed computing, parallel computing, that can operate synchronously or asynchronously, and in a few iterations, you can reach the same exact solution in a manner that requires, that the time required is almost independent of the size of this. Right? Because the size doubles, you have twice as many processors. The only thing that doesn't quite scale is the coordination, and still we know for sure that you can coordinate if at each iteration you have a central place that gets the result of these computations and adjusts penalties and step sizes and so on, and then everybody recomputes, et cetera, et cetera. But it's possible, and that's what we are looking at. And so the debate there, and these algorithms are quite mature. You can see at CDC publications, our latest paper is going to be in the December CDC. So you can do distributed coordination with some limited information flowing from each branch to its, from all branches or leaves to the root, rather than have one huge coordinator for everyone. And so it does work, and that's scalable, and that's feasible, and that's tractable, and so on. Now you'll tell me, do I trust this? I don't know, but I'm amazed that that cloud computation is working. 5 or 6 years ago, if somebody told me, or 10 years ago, that look, you know, you would send your information to 1,000 virtual machines. Some are in this cluster, some are in this other computer farm, and so on and so forth, and then you would collect back the information and be able to, I wouldn't believe it, but it's working. So we've made incredible advances. You know, see, these are some, so cloud computing, for example, is a qualitative gain that we've experienced in the so-called communication and computation revolution. That's not, that is qualitative and not just quantitative in terms of being able to solve faster. Just like fracking and lateral drilling, for example, was a disruptive and qualitative new change in our ability that has allowed our ability to exploit new reserves and so on. Now, will this be adopted? Will distribution utilities lie down and play dead and say, okay, I'm going to be an independent distribution operator. I'm just going to maintain the lines, and I'll have no interest in, I'm not sure how soon it's going to happen. Although there are, for example, in the Boston area, NSTAR is not really interested in serving customers. They're not interested in retail. They're so happy with the way that they're being paid for maintaining and expanding the distribution network that they're happy to give up the retail provision to others. Now, if you start paying them on the basis of these marginal costs, I'm not sure how happy they're going to be. Etc. So it's a new wave, it's a new age, just like the independent power producers came in and started to, what was it, the PERPA, 92, 87, I'm sorry. You know, so that was the beginning that ended up in actual markets in 97, which have spread and advanced and so on and so forth. How soon is this going to start? Maybe We are going to operate at a faster time scale this time. Maybe not. Anyway, but that gives you an idea of what the impact is on the service industry and on the manufacturing industry. So the manufacturing industry now should be looking at the cost of energy and the cost of reserves over time at that location. And some services are devilishly mobile. These are data centers or computer farms, because they can use the fiber lines to move load, move consumption over to the other side of the country, right? So, and again, electric vehicles are also mobile. They can charge here, they can charge there, and the costs are different depending on where they decide to charge and at what time they decide to charge. But whereas the mobility is important in the small with electric vehicles, the mobility is there in the large with data centers. And data centers right now consume about 3% of overall electricity, which is amazing, right? Who would think of this? I mean, computers, you think, do not consume very much. So I would have said 0.3%, are you sure? It's 3%? But it's 3% and growing, of which 2% is for computing and about 1% is for heating and cooling. If you add to that communication, our telephone lines consume direct current, what is it, 60-something volt, at the 60-something volt. And you have other sort of computing loads and so on. So all of that communication and computation together are responsible, as a service industry, are responsible for a big chunk of our computation, of our energy consumption, but they are also uniquely qualified to be responsive. Servers have the ability to change in milliseconds the speed with which they process a job, because each component of the central processing unit has its own transformer and can increase or decrease the voltage, which increases or decreases the speed of the clock. So you can have your CPU work faster, you can have your I/O work faster, and so on and so forth. Of course, one of these is going to be the bottleneck, just like in manufacturing, and that determines the highest speed that you can go into, but there's an almost linear region so you can regulate your speed, and if you are receiving regulation signals similar to the one that you are sending to the batteries. So then you can say you know that during this hour, for example, this is the average instructions per second that I want to perform for my jobs, and if I have excess capacity, I can increase or decrease the instructions per second and provide regulation service. Now, regulation service today is 1% of load, chicken feed. If you look at Europe, it's almost 4% because they gold plate things. But then if you read careful studies, they claim that this is going to be 2, 3, 4% if wind generation and non-dispatchable renewable generation increases to the levels that we expect them to increase. There are all sorts of DG studies that say, PJM today has 170 megawatts of secondary reserves. It's going to go to 190 if 20% of the capacity is wind. But it turns out that these studies were assuming that we're going to be spilling wind whenever we can't use it. If you don't spill wind, if you don't tell wind farms to stop generating, then you need a lot more reserves, fast reserves. And why not? If these reserves can be provided by the load side. And the load side can do this. Let me stop with this showing one more. The load side can do this more efficiently. So here is a combined cycle unit, 400 megawatt CCGT. Here it provides frequency control. You can see the fluctuations are very fast. So this is the fastest reserve. You need to have a very steep ramp rate. So therefore, you can provide less frequency control than you can secondary reserves. Secondary reserves, your ramp rate is less demanding. So if you promise 10 megawatts of let's say, or 5 megawatts of regulation reserve, then you should be able within 2.5 or 5 minutes, depending on whether you're providing fast or regular, within 2.5 minutes you should be able to jack up your generation or decrease it for that amount, right? So then you can provide much more. The 5 minutes here are half a minute. So with the same ramp rate, you can provide 1/10, right? The frequency control that you can regulation. So look at this guy. He's going up and down. He's providing 50 megawatts of regulation. However, not all 50. So there's a swing of almost 100. Not all of it is required. And so typically 80%. So it goes from minus 40 to plus 40. How many times does he do that? Maybe 7, 8 times over an hour. The cost to him is the loss in efficiency for accelerating and decelerating, right? So that's what he bids. So he bids a price for energy, and he bids a price for reserves. In order to provide regulation reserves, it has to, on the average, be dispatched at this level. So it can go up and down. The lower one should not go beyond its minimum generation, and the high one should not exceed its capacity, right? So you have a sort of an opportunity cost, because if the energy clearing price, if you decide to operate here on the average and the energy clearing price is higher than your variable cost, you have an opportunity cost, because actually you would have liked to operate at full capacity, and the other way around. If your marginal cost is higher than the clearing price, you would have liked to operate here. So you have an opportunity cost, and then you have the additional losses for going up and down. Okay. Parking garage charging electric vehicles. So you have 100 electric vehicles. During an hour, on the average, you decide to charge 50 of them. But sometimes you could be charging none. Sometimes you could be charging 100. So you can do the same swing without any efficiency loss, or the equivalent efficiency loss that the combustion turbine will have. So the demand side, computer farms also can do this without efficiency loss. Heating and cooling, you have some efficiency loss because you have additional friction if you try to circulate more air and so on and so forth. But there are many loads that can provide this service, make money, as long as they maintain an average utilization rate without efficiency loss. So therefore, the supply of reserves will cost less, and this is how we'll be able to accommodate more wind and renewables. Because otherwise, sooner or later, the feast will be over, the subsidies will have to be terminated. We can't have subsidies. We can have subsidies if 5 or 10% of if a small proportion of our energy comes from renewables, right? And we want to strengthen the market, et cetera. I mean, if we start getting 20, 30% of our energy from wind, you can't subsidize them. They have to be able to stand on their own. So therefore, we already know, you are reading in the newspapers, that on a megawatt hour basis, they are competitive with coal, almost, people say. But if you slap them with the reserves, the additional reserve requirements that that they will require in order to operate without having to spill 20% of their output or 30% of their output, then there will be less desirable. If we can secure these reserves from the load side at a low cost, then we are all winners. So these are some of the ideas, and manufacturing should try to do the same. Manufacturing should see how they can not only save energy, but how they can also provide reserves of this type, right? Even if, when at the time that we have excess supply from wind, even if you have to operate at a lower efficiency, since the cost will be close to zero of this electricity, right? It'll be free, more or less. We would spill it otherwise, right? It may be beneficial to modulate like this. Of course, you have to have excess capacity. Computer farms, traditionally, they've been utilized at 40, 50%, not much higher. Of course, Amazon is having a spot market, as you may know, on computing to utilize its additional spare capacity. It will run a spot market that will allow you to bid and say, okay, I want an hour, or I want 1,000 servers for an hour, but I'm willing to pay this very small price. You may be granted your wish, depending on what the overall demand is, right? And they make something rather than nothing out of it. So, and that of course couples with the desire of Amazon to accept additional services will depend on the price of electricity as well, because 1/3 of the cost is electricity in those computer farms. Okay, thank you. Yes.
So I'd like to pose the same question to you that was asked of the grid ops panel with regard to DSOs, because it's exactly the radial nature of it versus a more interconnected nature
Right.
that makes me think, does it need to be one, or could you have multiple?
Oh yes, yes.
geographic area? And I just-
Absolutely, you could have some feeder lines adopt marginal cost-based pricing scheme for distribution services, distribution costs, and some not. Just like wholesale markets, we had fewer, some came on board, but here we have more than 4 or 5 or 6 or 10. Here we have hundreds, thousands of, so a whole distribution company may go with it, or a distribution company could have some of its feeders operate this way, and some feeders operate another way. You could have energy service companies that go in and facilitate the demand response of people who are connected in these distribution networks, etc. Yes, so absolutely, it could start in the small, and we'll see how well it works.
Just following up on that, I mean, one of the things that you motivated this very nicely, talking about why in the wholesale market at the high voltage you can't really do reactive control pricing in practical terms, and you kind of intimated the market power concern. Realistically, within a radial distribution network, would you have the same problems though?
Less so, but if you have energy service companies
That's what I was thinking.
aggregate,
Wouldn't they basically
and we have a paper that we show that to a small extent, sort of you do the comparison of the social optimum and then the individual optimizations and so on and so forth, and you compare the Lagrangians and the optimality, and you see some extra terms that may give advantage if you can consume energy and provide reserves. Right. Because if you provide reserves, your reserves gain by higher losses, right? Because you translate them to a higher. So depending on the price at the high voltage, yeah. So these are some of the very important research issues.
We'll adjourn here and thank Michael again.
Thank you.
Here's a little token from Penn State, Little Mountain Lion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Thank you.